Chapter 89, Butterfly Transformation. In the middle of the night, Xu Qing cultivated the sea transformation art and broke through all the way to the 4th level. This speed was extremely exaggerated, and it also caused the hearts of the 7th peak's disciples outside to tremble. However, most of the people on the 7th peak like to hide their emotions. Hence, they noticed that Xu Qing's boat was a new one. After understanding that Xu Qing was a newly promoted disciple, most of them returned to their boats. On the surface, they didn't pay attention to him anymore. Everything was normal, but in reality, they had already begun to secretly probe. It was only when the sun slowly rose in the distant horizon and the sunlight landed on the surface of the sea, forming a piercing light that spread in all directions, that Xu Qing, who was in the small boat, opened his eyes. This time, the purple light in his eyes lasted for more than 10 breaths of time before it slowly dissipated, revealing astonishment. Although his cultivation speed in the latter half of the night was much slower, he still managed to break through from the 4th level of the sea transformation art to the 5th level. However, to reach such a level in a single night was also beyond Xu Qing's expectations. The mountains and seas arc and the sea transformation arc can complement each other. Xu Qing found it unbelievable. At this moment, he, who was sitting there, looked different from yesterday. His sharp edges and corners had become gentler. In fact, there was even a faint otherworldly temperament that was slowly developing. This was the aura brought about by the sea transformation art. After sensing the 500-foot-long spirit sea, his body, Xu Qing drew in a deep breath and recalled the words of the mountains and seas art. A Z could move mountains, while a Kui could move seas. However, he carefully analyzed and judged in his heart. In the end, he felt that the reason for this was partly because of the mountains and seas art, but more so because the meridians in his body were clear and there were no abnormalities at all. It was like an incomparably sturdy container that had been forged. It wasn't something that a cultivator's body could compare to. That was why it was able to contain a large amount of spirit energy during the early stages. This also explained why the cultivation speed had decreased during the latter half of the night. The capacity of the container wasn't infinite. However, from the fact that I still managed to break through one level in the latter half of the night, although my cultivation speed has decreased, it can still support me to continue improving rapidly. Xu Qing thought about it and his eyes gleamed. That night, not only did he improve his sea transformation art, but his mountains and seas art also improved by quite a bit. At that moment, he wasn't far from the 8th level. The most important thing was that every level of the sea transformation art recorded spells. Hence, he lowered his head and looked at his right hand. With a thought, a drop of seawater rapidly formed in his palm. In an instant, it transformed into a water ball the size of a human head. It kept transforming, sometimes into a throwing knife, sometimes into a small shield, and sometimes into a bird. In his hand, the water bowl was constantly changing. According to the different distribution of seawater, the focus of each item was different. Naturally, there were differences in their might. In the sea transformation art's jade slit, there were no less than 100 such changes recorded from the 1st level to the 10th level. At the same time that it emitted a chill, there was also an aura that belonged to the forbidden sea that could intimidate the enemy's mind. At the same time, in terms of might, Xu Qing could sense it slightly. The explosive power of this water ball was enough to intimidate all the 5th level check condensation cultivators he had seen on the scavenger campsite. Xu Qing weighed the situation. If he hadn't come to the 7 blood eyes, he would have been able to quickly kill all of them with less than 40 water balls. However, after sensing the 500-foot-long spirit sea in his body, he analyzed that he could release about 50 water balls. With such a number, if he was good at transformation, he would have to be extremely vigilant. Although he could still kill them, it would take a longer time. This was already very exaggerated. Xu Qing's mountains and seas art seemed to be at 70% completion. But compared to other people who cultivated the mountains and seas art, his combat strength was equivalent to the 10th level. After all, he had mastered the Kui Shadow Grand Formation. In other words, those who cultivated the mountains and seas art to the 10th level wouldn't be able to instantly kill a disciple at the 5th level of the 7th peak sea transformation art. All of this allowed Xu Qing's understanding of the 7 blood eyes to increase once again. He now had a deeper judgment of the endurance and strength of the Seventh Peak's disciples. The difference between rogue cultivators and sect disciples is too great. At that moment, confident that I can kill my past self within the time it takes for an incense stick to burn, Xu Qing muttered as his expression slowly lit up. Although his cultivation level didn't increase significantly, the increase in his combat strength made him feel that he was on the right path. At that moment in the morning, the sun's rays streamed into the cabin through the black canopy, forming Xu Qing's shadow on the deck. He then lowered his head and looked at the shadow. After a night of cultivation, all the anomalous substances were absorbed by the shadow. This caused his shadow to look even darker than before. If one were to take a closer look, it was as though the places it covered contained an abyss. At that moment, under Xu Qing's gaze, the shadow suddenly moved. As it swayed left and right, it stretched out its hands. After it clenched its fists, it spread out its fingers. This cycle repeated again, and its speed became faster and faster. It even rapidly lengthened and shrunk, looking extremely strange. A long time later, as a hint of fatigue appeared on Xu Qing's face, the shadow instantly returned to its original state and stopped moving. After going through the second round of assessment and the breakthrough in the sea transformation scripture, my control over my shadow has improved by leaps and bounds. Xu Qing lifted his head and looked at the sun outside. A long time later, he slowly stood up. After tidying up his belongings, he took out the gray Taoist robe and placed it on the table before touching it gently. After that, he waved his right hand, and a drop of seawater was formed. After it swelled into a water ball, it flattened out and eventually turned into a water mirror that reflected Xu Qing's figure. The face in the water mirror had a hint of immaturity and was incomparably delicate, containing a unique charm. Although it was dirty, the spirit in its eyes was like the stars, very dazzling. Looking at his reflection in the water mirror, Xu Qing fell silent for a moment before a look of determination appeared on his face. He then removed his scavenger clothes, revealing his refined and perfectly proportioned body after cultivating the mountains and seas art. 1. He raised his left hand and grabbed at the water mirror. Immediately, the water mirror headed straight for Xu Qing. When it got close, it transformed into a large amount of water vapor that directly covered his entire body. As it was continuously rinsed, black-colored sewage flowed down his slender body and spread to the ground beneath his feet. Xu Qing calmly stood there. This was the first time in 7 years that he had cleansed his body so thoroughly. This was because he knew that the current environment had changed. In the slums and scavenger camps, he, who was covered in dirt, was just like everyone else, so he wasn't conspicuous. However, here, if he was still the same as before, he would attract too much unnecessary attention. Although scavengers dressed like that would give people the feeling of poverty, the fact that he had a magic boat wasn't a secret. Anyone with a keen eye would know at a glance. So, if he still pretended to conceal it, it wouldn't mean much. Therefore, there was no change in his expression at all. He allowed the water vapor to wash over him, and his fair skin was gradually exposed to a large area. This was the case for his face and hair. A moment later, when the last trace of dirt on his body dissipated, Xu Qing opened his eyes. The sunlight streamed into the black tent, falling on his black hair and his face. It was as though he was reluctant to leave and wanted to gently flow through his entire body. Xu Qing felt a little uncomfortable and took a few steps back, allowing his body to fall into the darkness. The shadow in the darkness had a head of shiny black hair. He looked to be about 16 or 17 years old. He had slanted handsome brows, slender and sharp black eyes, thin and lightly pursed lips, well-defined facial features, and a slender figure. He was like an eagle that wanted to spread its wings in the dark night. He was cold, arrogant, and lonesome, yet he also exuded an imposing aura. He stood there alone, and when combined with the remaining immaturity on the youth's face, it caused his entire body to emit astonishing charm. Xu Qing lowered his head and looked at his hands. He then took out the inner parts of the gray Taoist robe and wore them one by one. Finally, he changed into the shoes given by the sect and put on the Taoist robe. After that, he waved his hand and water droplets appeared once again, washing away the blood stains from last night until it was completely clean. After Xu Qing walked out of the boat, under the sunlight, his entire person glowed with an indescribable vigor. It was like a gem covered in dust had its dust wiped away, revealing a dazzling light. This caused many of the patrolling guards on the shore to glance over. Xu Qing stood on the boat and narrowed his eyes, as though he wanted to block out the gazes from the outside world. When the sunlight shone directly on his skin, it also made him feel a little uncomfortable. However, he understood that this was a necessary experience for him. Hence, Xu Qing slowly opened his eyes and forced himself to adapt. A long time later, he took a deep breath and turned to get off the small boat. With a wave of his hand, he kept the small boat into a bottle and slowly walked away under the gaze of the patrolling guards. Today was the day he was to report to the homicide division. At the same time, he also planned to head to the medicine shop at the port to buy some medicinal herbs used to refine white pills and poison powder. The medicinal pills he had on him were now empty. The port in the morning was very lively. The merchant ships from the outside world and the disciples of the seventh peak that came man when filled over 100 harbors and caused the port to be bustling with activity. There were also many people coming and going. Most of the shops were also opening at this moment and the pedestrians on the streets also began their busy day. Xu Qing's arrival attracted some attention due to his appearance. However, to cultivators, looks were just appearances. Hence, most of them only took a glance before attracting their gazes. Xu Qing slowly got used to it. However, as he walked on the streets, he was still used to moving in the shadows. At the same time, on the way to the homicide division, Xu Qing also noticed that other than medicine shops, there were also some blacksmithing workshops and array carving shops. Through the jade slip of the magic boat, Xu Qing knew that not every disciple could refine a boat on their own. To the vast majority of disciples, they would usually send the materials and magic boats to the shops opened by the Sixth Peak's disciples or the array carving shops opened by the Fifth Summit's disciples to request for refinement. After paying attention to these shops, Xu Qing asked around and found out the location of 7th Peak's homicide division. He then quickly walked over. Not long later, a magnificent building appeared before Xu Qing. The gate of this building was very similar to the city lord's residence he had seen before, but the area inside was even larger. There were dozens of small buildings lined up and waves of pressure also spread out, suppressing the surroundings. This was especially so for the pitch-black statues. The two stone statues in front of the gate looked sinister, as though they were a combination of a human and a beast. They looked like rakshasas, and it was a shocking sight. It was cold and cheerless in front of the gate. Pedestrians would usually take a detour and avoid the area, not daring to get close. At that moment, at the entrance, there were two young cultivators dressed in gray doused robes. One was a man and the other was a woman. Both of them were in their 20s and had ordinary appearances. They were currently lazily leaning against the gatepost and yawning, as though they hadn't woken up. However, the instant Xu Qing walked over, the two of them immediately lifted their heads. Their gazes were like lightning as they landed on Xu Qing. Xu Qing's expression was calm as he walked over under the gazes of the two people. He wasn't too close and stopped at the entrance. He then cupped his fists and bowed. Disciple of the 7th Peak, Xu Qing, is here to report for duty. Newbie. The young man's eyes gleamed darkly as he swept his gaze over Xu Qing. However, his eyes soon narrowed slightly as though he could sense the extraordinary fluctuations from Xu Qing. Just when he was about to speak, his female companion beside him pushed him aside and rushed to Xu Qing's side. She then revealed a gentle and beautiful smile when she saw Xu Qing's face. "Junior brother, what are you here for?" "He already said that he's here to report. Why are you still asking?" The young man smiled faintly. The female cultivator didn't seem to hear this and continued to look at Xu Qing. Xu Qing instinctively took a few steps back. He didn't like to be too close to others, so he habitually observed the two of them. This was especially so when he instinctively cast a few more glances at the necks of the man and woman.